Picture this. You're standing in front of a mirror, but instead of seeing your reflection, you see everyone you've ever tried to love staring back at you. And in that moment, something shifts. You realize that every time you thought you were reaching out to touch another person, you were actually just rearranging the furniture of your own loneliness. Every embrace was a desperate attempt to feel less like a separate island floating in an infinite sea. Every I love you was secretly asking, please prove to me that I exist. Here's the question that might keep you up tonight. What if the very thing you call yourself is the wall between you and everyone else? What if the you that's trying so hard to love is actually the problem, not the solution? And what if the greatest act of love you could ever offer has nothing to do with giving more of yourself, but with discovering that this yourself you've been protecting and polishing and presenting to the world is nothing more than a magnificent illusion? Stay with me, because by the end of this exploration inspired by Alan Watts, you're going to understand something that will completely transform how you relate to every person in your life. And I'm going to show you a simple practice that you can use today, right after this video, that will begin to dissolve the invisible barrier between you and genuine connection. Now, let's start with something most people never want to admit. You don't actually love other people. Not really. Not yet. What you call love is usually just a complex negotiation. You're trading pieces of your performance for pieces of their validation. You show up as the version of yourself you think they want to see, and in return you expect them to confirm that this version is valuable, worthy, lovable. It's an exhausting transaction dressed up in the language of intimacy. Think about the last time you said I love you to someone. Be honest. Wasn't there a subtle expectation attached to it? A quiet contract? I'll be this for you if you'll be that for me. I'll meet your needs if you'll meet mine. I'll play my role if you'll play yours. This isn't love, this is theater. And the problem with theater is that it requires actors, and actors require masks, and masks require a face beneath them that's terrified of being seen. Alan Watts understood something that most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. The self you think you are is a story you're telling, and you've been telling it for so long that you've forgotten it's fiction. You wake up every morning and slip into this character called me, like putting on a costume. You have a name, a history, a collection of preferences and opinions and wounds. You have an image to maintain, a reputation to protect, a narrative to defend. And all of this creates a boundary, a border, a sense of being a separate entity sealed off from everything else. And here's where it gets interesting. This separate self, this me that you're so convinced is real, cannot actually love. It can want, it can need, it can crave, and grasp, and possess. But it cannot love, because love requires dissolution, and the separate self is built entirely on the project of remaining separate. The moment genuine love appears, the walls start to crack, and the ego panics because its entire existence depends on those walls staying intact. You've probably felt this. Those moments when you're with someone and suddenly all your defenses come up. They say something that threatens your image of yourself, and immediately you're no longer present with them. You're busy managing your reaction, crafting your response, protecting your territory. Or they get too close, and you feel this strange suffocation, this need to pull back and re-establish your independence. That's not love resisting love. That's the false self sensing danger, sensing that it might have to disappear, and doing everything it can to survive. What Alan Watts invites us to see is that the boundary between you and others is not a fact of nature, it's a habit of perception. You learned very early in life that you are a separate thing, a little isolated consciousness trapped inside a body, fundamentally alone in a universe of other separate things, and from that assumption all your suffering flows, because if you're truly separate, then love becomes an impossible bridge across a canyon that can never really be crossed. You can shout across the gap, you can throw ropes across it, but you can never actually reach the other side. You remain forever sealed in your own experience, and so does everyone else. But what if that canyon is imaginary? What if the separation you feel is not a cosmic fact but a learned illusion? What if you and the person you're trying to love are not two separate islands but two waves in the same ocean, two notes in the same song, two movements in the same dance? This isn't poetry. This is closer to reality than the story of separation you've been believing. Here's what starts to happen when you really let this sink in. You begin to notice that the boundary between in here and out there is remarkably fuzzy. Where exactly do you end and the world begin? Is it at your skin? But your skin is constantly exchanging molecules with the air. Is it at your thoughts? But your thoughts are made of language and ideas that came from outside you. Is it at your feelings? but your feelings are responses to a world you didn't create and can't fully control. The more you look for the edge of yourself, the more it dissolves like morning mist. And this dissolution, this softening of the boundary, this is where love becomes possible. Not love as a transaction, not love as a need, but love as a recognition. A recognition that the other person is not actually other. They're another expression of the same underlying reality that's expressing itself as you. When you look into their eyes, you're not seeing a stranger across a divide. You're seeing yourself looking back at yourself through a different set of eyes. The universe is playing hide and seek with itself, pretending to be separate so it can experience the joy of reunion. Now your ego hates this idea. It hates it with a passion, because the ego is the sense of being a separate self, and if that separation is revealed to be illusory, the ego doesn't just lose its power, it loses its existence. So it will fight. It will tell you this is naive spiritual fantasy. It will remind you of all the times you've been hurt, all the ways people have failed you, all the reasons you need to protect yourself. It will insist that boundaries are not just useful but essential, that without a strong sense of self you'll be lost, vulnerable, taken advantage of. And here's the paradox Alan Watts loved to point out. You don't actually have to destroy the ego or get rid of the self. That would be like trying to get rid of your own shadow. The self is not a thing that exists and needs to be eliminated. It's a process, a pattern, a way of organizing experience. What needs to happen is not destruction but recognition. You need to see through the illusion. You need to recognize that the self is like a character in a dream, and you are the dreaming, not the character. When this recognition happens, something miraculous occurs. You can still function as a person. You still have a name, a body, a history, preferences, relationships, but you're no longer imprisoned by the belief that this person is all you are. You're no longer defending it desperately, because you know it's just a temporary role you're playing, not the totality of what you are. And from that space of freedom, from that lightness, real love becomes possible. Because now, when you're with another person, you're not there as a needy separate self trying to extract something from another needy separate self. You're there as presence meeting presence, as awareness recognizing awareness, as the universe encountering itself through two different windows. There's no negotiation needed, no performance required, no contract to honor. You're simply there, open and available, without the constant static of self-concern drowning out the signal of genuine connection. This is why truly loving people often seem to have less of a self, not more. They're not impressive in the way the ego wants to be impressive. They don't fill up the room with their personality. They don't need to prove anything or position themselves or defend their territory. They're like clear windows. Light passes through them without distortion. You can be with them and feel somehow more yourself, more alive, because they're not imposing their agenda on every moment. They've dissolved enough of their false self that space has opened up for genuine meeting. And here's something beautiful that happens as you dissolve. You stop trying to fix people. You stop needing them to change so you can be okay. You stop projecting your unlived life onto them and expecting them to fulfill your fantasies. You stop being disappointed when they turn out to be human rather than the idealized image you constructed. You can finally see them as they are, in all their complexity and contradiction. And you can love them not despite their flaws, but including their flaws, because you've recognized that flaws and perfection are just stories the mind tells about what is. You also stop taking things personally, which is perhaps one of the greatest gifts you can give to any relationship. When someone is angry or cold or distant, you don't immediately make it about you, about something you did wrong, about your inadequacy or their rejection. You can see that they're having their own experience, moved by forces much larger than your interaction, and you can hold space for that without collapsing into self-concern. This doesn't mean you become a doormat, it means you become clear. You can set boundaries when needed, but you're doing it from clarity, not from the wounded ego's need to punish or protect. Alan Watts would sometimes talk about how we're all caught in what he called the skin-encapsulated ego. We feel like we're a little person trapped inside a bag of skin, looking out at a world that's fundamentally separate from us. And from that feeling comes all our isolation, all our fear, all our desperate attempts to bridge the unbridgeable gap. But the truth is simpler and more extraordinary. You are not inside your body is inside you. The entire universe is inside you, because you are not a separate fragment of the universe. You are the universe experiencing itself from this particular point of view. When you really get this, not just intellectually but as a lived recognition, your relationships transform, because you're no longer coming to people as a beggar asking them to fill your emptiness. You're coming as fullness meeting fullness. as space meeting space. And in that meeting, something entirely new becomes possible. Not the claustrophobic intensity of two separate selves clinging to each other in mutual desperation, but the open intimacy of shared being. This doesn't mean you won't have preferences or desires or feelings. You're still human. You'll still want certain things in relationship. You'll still feel hurt sometimes, still experience conflict, still navigate all the messy complexity of human connection. But underneath all of that, there's a foundation that wasn't there before. A ground of basic okayness that doesn't depend on the other person doing or being anything in particular. And that changes everything. Because now you can afford to be vulnerable. Not vulnerable in the way the ego thinks of vulnerability, which is about strategically revealing your wounds to manipulate sympathy, but genuinely vulnerable, which means open, undefended, willing to be touched and changed by the encounter. You can afford this because you're not protecting a separate self anymore. You've seen through that fiction, so there's nothing to protect, nothing to lose, because what you actually are can't be diminished or damaged by anything that happens in the realm of form. This is the great irony. The separate self tries desperately to protect itself, to build walls and maintain control, and in doing so it creates the very isolation it fears. But when you dissolve that false sense of separation, when you stop defending your borders, you discover that you were never actually vulnerable in the way you thought. The boundaries you were protecting were imaginary, and the self you were defending never really existed except as a story. And here's where it gets practical, because all of this might sound beautiful but abstract. How do you actually dissolve the self? How do you move from the prison of separation into the freedom of connection? The answer is going to disappoint your ego, because the ego wants a technique, a method, a 10-step program. But the truth is simpler. You just stop. You stop defending. You stop performing. You stop trying to be someone. You catch yourself in the act of self-construction, and you relax the effort. It happens in small moments. You're with someone and you notice the urge to say something impressive, to position yourself in a certain way, to manage their perception of you. And instead of following that urge, you just breathe and let it pass. You notice the feeling of separation, the sense of being a separate observer, looking at another separate person, and you soften that boundary. You let yourself feel that you're not separate from the air between you, not separate from the space that holds you both, not separate from the awareness that's aware of all of it. You notice when you're listening to someone, but you're not really listening because you're busy preparing your response, or comparing their experience to yours, or waiting for your turn to talk, and you stop. You let go of your agenda, and actually receive what they're offering. Not because you should, not because it's the right thing to do, but because you're curious, because there's a genuine interest in what's happening when you're not filtering everything through the lens of self-concern. And slowly, with practice, the habit of being a separate self loosens its grip. Not because you're trying to destroy it, but because you're seeing through it. You're recognizing it as a pattern, not as truth. And in that recognition, space opens up. Space for love. Not love as an emotion or a feeling or a state that comes and goes, but love as the natural consequence of seeing reality more clearly. When the illusion of separation dissolves even a little bit, love is what's left. It's not something you have to create or cultivate. It's what you are underneath the story of being someone separate who needs something from someone else. This is what Alan Watts was pointing to when he talked about the wisdom of insecurity, about the need to let go, about the fundamental playfulness of existence. He understood that the game of pretending to be separate selves is just that, a game, and like any game, it's more fun when you know you're playing. When you take it seriously, when you believe the role is real, it becomes suffering. But when you recognize the game, when you see that the separate self is a costume you're wearing, not a prison you're trapped in, everything becomes lighter, more spacious, more loving. And here's the promise I made at the beginning. Here's the insight that can begin to transform your relationships right now. The separate self you've been trying to protect and improve and present to the world is not the problem because it's flawed or broken or inadequate. It's the problem because it's imaginary. You are not a separate self trying to connect with other separate selves. You are the connecting itself. You are the space in which all relationships happen. You are the awareness that's aware of both yourself and others, and that awareness is not trapped inside your head. It's vast and open, and includes everything. So here's your practice, and it's almost absurdly simple. Today, just once, when you're with another person, let yourself feel that you are not separate from them. Not as an idea, but as a physical sensation. Feel that the space between you is not empty distance, but alive and connective. Feel that the boundary of your skin is not a wall but a permeable membrane. Feel that their breath and your breath are participating in the same atmosphere. Feel that their experience and your experience are both appearing in the same field of awareness. Just for a moment, just as an experiment. And notice what happens. Notice if something relaxes. Notice if the usual static of self-consciousness quiets down a little. Notice if there's more room for genuine seeing, genuine hearing, genuine meeting. You don't have to believe anything. You don't have to change your philosophy. You just have to pay attention differently for a moment and see what's actually there when you're not imposing the story of separation onto it. This is the beginning of dissolving the self, not dramatically, not with some cosmic explosion of enlightenment, but quietly, gradually, through repeated recognition that the boundaries you've been maintaining are optional, that you can soften them, that underneath the story of being someone separate and insufficient, there's something vast and complete and naturally loving, and that's what you actually are. So if you found something valuable in this exploration, subscribe to this channel because we're going to keep diving into these ideas that Alan Watts spent his life articulating. Ideas that don't just live in books but that can actually transform how you experience being alive. And leave a comment letting me know what shifted in your perspective after hearing this. What changed in your understanding of yourself and others? What became possible that wasn't possible before? I want to hear your experience because these insights become real through sharing, through dialogue, through collective recognition. And if you know someone who's struggling in their relationship, someone who's caught in the exhausting cycle of trying to get love right while defending themselves at the same time, share this video with them, not because you're trying to fix them, but because maybe they're ready to hear what you just heard. Maybe they're ready to discover that the problem was never about finding the right person or saying the right thing or being enough. The problem was the belief in being a separate self in the first place. In our next exploration, we're going to look at another dimension of Alan Watts's wisdom, the illusion of psychological time, and why your obsession with past and future is preventing you from ever actually living. Because just as you can't love others until you dissolve yourself, you also can't be present until you dissolve your belief in time as something real, rather than as a mental construct. That's coming next, so make sure you're subscribed. For now, remember this. You are not a separate wave trying desperately to connect with other separate waves. You are the ocean, playing at being waves. And when you recognize that, even for a moment, love stops being something you have to work at and becomes what you naturally are. The barrier between you and everyone else is made of thought, and thought can dissolve. That's the gift. That's the freedom. That's the love you've been searching for, waiting to be discovered not out there in another person, but in the dissolution of the one who was searching,